All right, let's unpack this out. PCI DSS, specifically all those big changes coming down the pike with version 4.0.
Smart to be looking at it now.
Yeah, March 2025, that's when it all becomes mandatory. So,
Yeah.
from what I've gathered, you really want to get the full picture, huh? Like,
Yeah.
what's changing? Why is it changing? And what does it mean for businesses?
Yeah, that's the plan.
Cool. That's what we're going to be tackling today. We're going to be breaking down the key updates, talking about what they mean for security, and this is where it gets really interesting how one company, human, is claiming they can help businesses navigate all this.
That's cool.
Yeah. So, first things first, let's set the scene a little bit, right? We've got this ever-evolving cybersecurity threat landscape. It's not exactly breaking news that the bad guys are upping their game every single day, especially in the payment card industry.
Yeah, it's an arms race, really.
Yeah, it really is. And that's where PCI DSS 4.0 comes in. It's all about raising the security bar across the board. So what are some of the biggest changes that people should be aware of? I keep seeing this term MFA, multi-factor authentication.
That's a critical one. Like imagine, someone gets hold of your password, right? Maybe through phishing or they bought it on the dark web.
Yeah.
Even if they have that password, they still can't get in because they need a second factor, like a code from your phone or a fingerprint scan. It's that double lock on your door. That's what 4.0 is doing.
That makes sense. Not relying on just one point of failure.
Exactly. And speaking of points of failure, passwords themselves are, well, a bit of a weak link.
Oh, tell me about it. I mean, we've all been guilty of using password 123 at some point.
Well, I'll say goodbye to those days because PCI DSS is requiring a minimum of 12 characters now for passwords protecting cardholder data.
Oh, wow.
And they're emphasizing complexity.
Yeah.
You can't just add a few numbers to a simple word. It makes it way harder to crack with those brute force attacks where hackers just keep trying different combinations till something works.
So it's like making them work harder for a much smaller payoff, hopefully.
You got it.
Yeah.
But, it's not just about stronger authentication and passwords. We're also seeing this big push to secure APIs,
Yeah.
application programming interfaces, right? They're basically like the messengers behind the scenes, allowing different systems to talk to each other.
Right. And
Yeah.
with all these API-based payment systems exploding, are you saying that's where the new vulnerabilities are popping up?
Yeah, kind of. You build this awesome fortress with strong walls, but then you leave a back door wide open.
Yeah.
That's kind of what a vulnerable API can be. Attackers can exploit those, get to that sensitive information, and even pull off unauthorized transactions. Version 4.0 is trying to address that with specific guidelines for securing APIs.
So it's not just protecting the front of the website, it's all those intricate connections happening behind the scenes too.
Yeah. It goes even deeper than that, too. We're seeing more focus on real-time monitoring and threat detection in 4.0.
I imagine that's causing some headaches.
It's definitely a change, but it's a necessary one. Imagine you have a security guard who's always patrolling, constantly, as opposed to checking in just once a day.
Okay.
Organizations are now required to use automated tools to continuously monitor their web applications for things like SQL injection and cross-site scripting attacks.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Break those down for me a little bit. What exactly are SQL injection and cross-site scripting?
So, basically, imagine an attacker slipping in a secret note into a database query.
Right.
That tricks the system into revealing sensitive information.
Oh, wow.
That's SQL injection. And then cross-site scripting, it's similar, but instead of going straight for the database, they inject malicious code that runs in the user's browser,
Yeah.
potentially stealing their data, or even hijacking their whole session.
Okay, now I see why the real-time monitoring is so crucial, right? Catching those attacks before they do any real damage.
Yes, that's the goal, right?
Yeah.
You want to detect anything suspicious, immediately.
Yeah.
And have that response ready. Be proactive.
Proactive, yeah. So, okay, with all these moving parts, what does it actually mean to be PCI DSS compliant?
So basically, it means adhering to 12 core security standards, and those have, get this, over 200 specific requirements.
Oh my.
We won't bore you with every single one.
Okay, good.
But think of things like firewalls, getting rid of those default passwords that come from vendors, encrypting any data transmission, regularly testing your security systems, building a security-first culture.
Makes sense. But I'm guessing there are different levels of compliance depending on the size of the business, right?
You're spot on. There are actually 4 levels, and they're based on transaction volume. As you can imagine, the more transactions you're processing, the higher the stakes, the more stringent those requirements become.
So it scales with the risk, basically.
Exactly. But no matter the level, the core idea is the same. Protect that cardholder data like it's the crown jewels.
I like that. Good analogy. So how do businesses actually prove they're compliant? Is there like a PCI DSS exam you have to pass?
Not exactly an exam, but there are processes.
Yeah.
All 4 levels. You got to complete a self-assessment questionnaire.
Hmm.
Basically like a really detailed checklist where you document all your security practices.
Okay.
Then levels 1 and 2, those deal with the larger transaction volumes. They also need to submit a report on compliance and ROCE.
Okay.
And then that highest level, level 1, they have to go through annual audits by a qualified security assessor,
Yeah.
like an outside expert coming in, really vetting your security.
Wow. So there's definitely a lot involved. But I'm assuming the benefits of being compliant outweigh all that effort.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Put yourself in the customer's shoes.
Yeah.
You land on a website and you see that PCI DSS compliant seal. You instantly feel a sense of security, right? You know they take data protection seriously. And that trust, you can't put a price on that these days.
Yeah.
Plus, compliance massively reduces the risk of those cyber attacks.
And let's not forget about those hefty fines for non-compliance. I mean, I've seen figures as high as $500,000.
Yeah, that's a blow no business wants to deal with. And, the financial fallout of a breach can be crippling, especially if you're found to be non-compliant. So even just from a purely financial standpoint, compliance makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so compliance is good for security, good for customer trust, good for the bottom line. It's kind of a no-brainer. But earlier you mentioned a company called Human. Where do they fit into this whole picture?
Yeah. So they're a cybersecurity company and they're making waves in this space. They offer solutions specifically designed to help businesses tackle the challenges that come with these new PCI DSS requirements, especially the ones around client-side security, which we've been talking a lot about.
So they're the ones helping businesses wrangle all those third-party scripts and make sure nothing bad's slipping through.
Exactly. Their flagship product is actually called Client-Side Defense, and it aims to really simplify compliance with requirements 6.4.3 and 11.6.1.
Those were the ones related to script inventory and HTTP header modifications, right?
Yes. Think of 6.4.3 like a strict inventory policy for your website.
Okay.
So businesses need a complete list of every client-side script running on their payment pages.
Yeah.
And it's not just a list. They got to justify why each one's necessary and ensure its integrity.
So knowing it hasn't been tampered with.
Exactly. It's not just, oh, we have this script. We know where it came from and we know it's legitimate.
Okay. What about 11.6.1? What's that all about?
That one focuses on HTTP headers. You know how when you send a letter, you have the address, return address, the stamp, all that info that tells the Postal Service what to do with it.
Yeah, it's like the instructions for the letter.
Exactly. HTTP headers, they're like instructions for communication between your browser and the web server.
Okay.
Usually they're working behind the scenes, everything runs smoothly. But an attacker, if they manipulate those headers, they can hijack the whole conversation, steal sensitive data in transit. So 11.6.1 is about making sure those headers haven't been tampered with, setting off alarms if anything's suspicious.
So together, those two requirements are kind of like putting a security detail around the browser itself.
Yeah, making sure no one's messing with the communication or slipping in any malicious code.
Exactly. And zooming out a bit to the bigger picture, what about attacks like Magcart and form jacking?
Oh, yeah. Those are definitely ones you want to avoid. Imagine you're on the website, you're filling out a form with, your credit card details. Everything seems normal.
Yeah.
But behind the scenes, malicious code is skimming your info right off the page, like a digital pickpocket.
That's form jacking.
That's form jacking. Magcart is similar, but it focuses specifically on e-commerce checkout pages. It's all about exploiting vulnerabilities in those third-party scripts. The ones that websites use for stuff like chatbots and analytics,
Right.
stealing payment information.
You might think you're on a legit site, but they're exploiting weaknesses in the code to steal your data without you even knowing.
Yeah, it is pretty unsettling.
Yeah.
And that's why, by strengthening browser security, PCI DSS 4.0 aims to make those kinds of attacks much, much harder to pull off.
Makes sense. But I gotta admit, it sounds like a real logistical nightmare for businesses. How are they supposed to keep track of all those scripts, especially with third-party vendors constantly updating their code?
You're hitting on a real pain point here. It's not just about knowing what scripts are running, it's understanding that whole chain of dependencies. Imagine you buy a car, right?
Right.
But that car uses parts from dozens of different manufacturers. Now imagine trying to keep track of all those manufacturers and making sure that every single part is up to date and secure.
Yeah, that's a headache and a half.
It is. It's what we call the nth party vendor problem. You might have a third party vendor who sourced their code from another vendor, who sourced their code from another vendor. It becomes a tangled web of dependencies, and somewhere deep in that web, there might be a vulnerability just waiting to be exploited.
It's a security nightmare waiting to happen.
It can be.
Yeah.
And then you add in the issue of speed versus security. Developers, they're under pressure to release new features quickly, so they might not fully vet third-party code before integrating it.
So even if a company has the best intentions, they could still introduce vulnerable code just by trying to keep up with everything.
It's a common scenario. And it's exactly why these new PCI DSS requirements, as challenging as they may seem, they're really crucial. They force businesses to really look at what's happening in the browser and adopt a more proactive security-first approach. It's shifting from, oops, we had a breach, let's fix it, to how do we prevent this from ever happening in the first place?
It's a big shift in how we think about web security.
It is. So knowing these vulnerabilities exist and knowing businesses are dealing with all this, how are attackers actually exploiting these things? What are the methods they're using to target these payment systems?
Well, I know some of the classic attacks involve things like, installing malware on point-of-sale systems to steal data during transactions.
Right. That's a common one. Or injecting malicious code directly into e-commerce websites. Skim credit card information right off the payment forms.
But it sounds like the focus is shifting more towards those client-side attacks, right? Taking advantage of all the third-party scripts and vulnerabilities we talked about.
You're exactly right. And it's because of how modern web applications are built. They rely on these third-party scripts for everything, from chatbots to social media integration, analytics, you name it. And cyber criminals know this. They're exploiting those dependencies to their advantage.
Can you give us an example? Like, how would one of these attacks actually play out in the real world?
Sure. Let's say you're browsing an e-commerce website. You decide to use their live chat feature to ask a question about a product.
Yeah.
Seems harmless enough, right?
Totally.
But that live chat feature, it's often powered by a third-party script hosted on a completely different server outside of that website's control. Now imagine that server gets compromised. An attacker injects malicious code into that seemingly innocent chat script.
Oh, no. I see where you're going with this.
Right. So as soon as you start chatting, that code gets executed right there in your browser. And from there, they could potentially steal your credit card info, login credentials, any sensitive data without the website even knowing it's happening.
It's terrifying, and I bet it happens more than we realize.
Yeah, it's the insidious thing about these client-side attacks, right? They often fly under the radar because the malicious code is hidden within these legitimate-looking scripts.
A wolf in sheep's clothing.
Exactly. So we've got vulnerabilities, and attackers are actively exploiting them. But where does all this data go? What are they doing with it once they have it?
Good question.
There's this whole thriving black market for this type of information.
Yeah.
Stolen cardholder data is often packaged and sold on the dark web, where it can fuel all sorts of fraud.
So one credit card number can fuel a whole chain of criminal activity.
Exactly. One common use is for something called carding attacks.
Okay.
Fraudsters use those stolen credit card details to make fraudulent purchases. They might buy goods directly or purchase gift cards, which they can then resell.
Right. And all of this, of course, comes at a cost to businesses.
Absolutely. Carding attacks, they've skyrocketed in recent years. The cost of fraud goes way beyond just the value of the goods. Businesses have to deal with chargebacks, fees. They hit to their reputation.
Okay, so we've painted kind of a grim picture here, but amidst all this talk of vulnerabilities and attacks, let's circle back to PCI DSS compliance. You mentioned earlier that being compliant has some real tangible benefits. Can you kind of unpack that a bit more for us?
Yeah, of course. While compliance can seem daunting, it's in a business's best interest. First and foremost, it really significantly reduces the risk of those attacks we've been discussing.
Right.
By implementing those 12 core security standards, you're making your systems much harder to breach.
So it's like adding extra layers of armor.
Exactly. And that, of course, can save a business tons of money and headaches in the long run. It's much cheaper to prevent a breach than it is to clean up the mess afterwards.
Yeah, much cheaper.
But it goes beyond the financial stuff. Compliance plays a huge role in building trust with your customers. When they see that PCI DSS compliant seal, they know you're taking security seriously, their data is in safe hands. That kind of trust can be a big advantage these days.
Right, because at the end of the day, it's all about protecting those customer relationships, right? No one wants to shop at a place where they feel like their information is at risk.
Exactly. And of course, let's not forget about those hefty fines we talked about.
Huh.
Avoiding those penalties from the PCI Security Standards Council, it's another reason to prioritize compliance.
It's a win-win all around.
It is.
Okay, so compliance is good for security, good for customer trust, good for the bottom line. Seems like a no-brainer. But you mentioned earlier, version 4.0 places a huge emphasis on securing customer browsers.
Yeah,
That seems like a pretty big shift. Why is that such a big deal?
that's a question we get a lot.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's something many businesses are still trying to wrap their heads around. The browser has become a major battleground in the fight for payment security. In the past, PCI DSS was really focused on securing servers and networks.
Right.
But with the rise of these client-side attacks, the focus has shifted to protecting what's happening within the customer's browser.
Okay.
A whole new ballgame.
I can only imagine how complex that gets. So how exactly is 4.0 tackling this?
Well, they've introduced some really specific requirements, two in particular that, really stand out.
Right.
6.4.3 and 11.6.1.
Okay.
So 6.4.3, think of it like a strict inventory policy for your website.
Right.
It says businesses, they have to have a complete list of every single client-side script running on their payment pages.
Oh, wow.
And not just a list, they need to justify why each script is necessary
Okay.
and make sure that, it has integrity. Basically, they got to be able to prove that that code hasn't been tampered with.
So it's not just about having the script, it's about knowing where it came from, making sure it's legit.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, what about 11.6.1?
That one focuses on those sneaky HTTP headers. You know how when you send a letter, you have the address, the return address, the stamp, all that information that tells the Postal Service what to do with it?
Right, like the instructions for the letter.
Exactly. HTTP headers are like instructions for communication between your browser and the web server.
Okay.
They're usually working behind the scenes, making sure everything's running smoothly. But if an attacker can manipulate those headers, they can, hijack the whole conversation
Yeah.
and steal sensitive data. So 11.6.1 is all about making sure those headers haven't been messed with, setting off alarm bells if anything suspicious is detected.
So together, those two requirements are kind of like you're putting a security detail around the browser itself,
That's a great way to put it.
making sure that no one's messing with the communication or slipping in any malicious code. And if we kind of zoom out a little bit and look at the bigger picture, what about attacks like Magcart and form jacking?
Oh, those are nasty ones.
Yeah.
Definitely ones you want to avoid. Imagine you're on a website filling out a form with your credit card details. Everything seems normal, but behind the scenes, malicious code is skimming your information right off the page, like a digital pickpocket.
And that's form jacking.
That's form jacking. Magcart's similar, but it focuses specifically on e-commerce checkout pages,
Okay.
exploiting vulnerabilities in those third-party scripts, the little bits of code that websites use for things like chatbots and analytics to steal payment information.
So you might think you're on a legitimate site, but they're taking advantage of weaknesses in the code to steal your data.
Right, without you even knowing.
That's scary.
Yeah, and that's why, by strengthening browser security, PCI DSS version 4.0
Yeah.
is aiming to make those types of attacks a lot harder to pull off.
Okay, that makes sense. But I gotta admit, it sounds incredibly difficult for businesses. How on earth are they supposed to keep track of all those scripts, especially with third-party vendors constantly updating their code?
You're right. It's one of the biggest challenges here. It's not just about knowing what scripts are running. It's about understanding that whole chain of dependencies.
Right.
It's like, imagine you buy a car,
Yeah.
but that car relies on parts from, dozens of different manufacturers.
Okay.
Now imagine trying to keep track of every single one of those manufacturers and making sure every part is up to date and secure.
Oh, that sounds like a nightmare.
It's what we call the nth party vendor problem.
Okay.
You might have a third party vendor who sourced their code from another vendor, who sourced their code from yet another vendor. It becomes this tangled web of dependencies, and somewhere deep in that web, there might be a vulnerability just waiting to be exploited.
It's like a ticking time bomb.
It can be, yeah. And then you add in the issue of speed versus security. Developers are often under pressure to, release new features quickly, which means they might not thoroughly vet that third-party code before integrating it.
So even if a company has the best intentions, they could still be introducing vulnerable code just by trying to keep up.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's pretty common. And it's exactly why these new PCI DSS requirements, as challenging as they might seem, they're so important. They're forcing businesses to take a closer look at what's happening in the browser and to adopt a more proactive approach to security.
It's about moving away from that, oops, we had a breach, let's fix it,
What?
mentality.
Exactly. It's about how do we prevent this from happening in the first
A
place?
huge shift.
It is. So knowing all this, knowing these vulnerabilities are out there, how are attackers actually exploiting them? What are they doing to target payment systems?
Well, I know some of the more classic attacks involve things like installing malware on point-of-sale systems to steal data during transactions.
Yeah, that's a classic one. Or injecting malicious code directly into e-commerce websites, to skim credit card information right off the payment forms.
But it sounds like the focus is shifting more and more towards these client-side attacks, right? Taking advantage of all those third-party scripts and vulnerabilities.
You're exactly right.
Hmm.
And it's because of how modern web applications are built these days. They rely so heavily on those third-party scripts for, everything. Chatbots, social media integration, analytics, all of it. And cyber criminals, they know this. They're exploiting it to their advantage.
Can you give us an example of how that would actually play out in the real world?
Sure. Let's say you're browsing an e-commerce website and you decide to use their live chat feature to ask a question about a product.
Yeah, I do that all the time.
Seems harmless enough.
Okay, totally.
But here's the thing. That live chat feature, it's often powered by a third-party script, hosted on a totally different server, outside of the website's control.
Oh.
So now imagine that server gets compromised. An attacker injects some malicious code into that innocent-looking chat script.
Oh, no, I see where this is going.
So as soon as you start chatting, that code gets executed right there in your browser. And from there, the attacker could steal your credit card information, login credentials, anything, without the website owner even knowing it's happening.
That's terrifying. And I bet it happens more than we realize.
It's the insidious thing about these client-side attacks. They often fly under the radar
Yeah.
because the code is hidden within these legitimate-looking scripts.
It's like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Exactly. So we've got these vulnerabilities and attackers are exploiting them. But where's all this data going? What are they doing with it once they have it?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, there's this whole underground market for this kind of information.
Right.
Stolen credit card data is often packaged up, sold on the dark web, and used to commit all sorts of fraud.
So it's like one stolen credit card can fuel a whole chain of criminal activity.
Exactly. And one of those common uses is for something called carding attacks.
Carding attacks.
So that's where fraudsters use the stolen credit card details to make purchases. They might buy goods directly, or they might buy gift cards, which they can then resell or use to buy other stuff.
And of course, all of this comes at a cost to businesses.
Big time. Carding attacks have really exploded in recent years. And the cost of fraud, it goes way beyond just the value of the stolen goods. Businesses have to deal with chargebacks, fees, the damage to their reputation.
Right, it's a whole mess.
It is. So, we've painted kind of a grim picture here, but amidst all this talk of vulnerabilities and attacks, let's go back to PCI DSS compliance.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that being compliant has some tangible benefits.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, while compliance can seem overwhelming, it really is in a business's best interest. First and foremost, it significantly lowers the risk of those cyber attacks we've been talking about, right? By implementing those 12 core security standards, you're making your systems much harder to breach, like adding those extra layers of armor we talked about.
Exactly. And that could save a business a lot of money in the long run. It's much cheaper to prevent a breach than to deal with the aftermath.
Much cheaper, yeah.
But it goes beyond just the financial side, too. Compliance plays a huge role in building trust with your customers. When they see that seal, that PCI DSS compliant seal,
Yeah, right.
they know you take security seriously and that their data is in safe hands. That kind of trust can be a major advantage in today's world.
Especially today.
Definitely.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's all about protecting those customer relationships. No one wants to shop at a place where they feel like their data's at risk.
Right. They'll go somewhere else.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget about those hefty fines we talked about. Avoiding those penalties from the PCI Security Standards Council is another big reason to prioritize compliance.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's a win-win situation all around.
Definitely.
Okay, so compliance is good for security, it's good for customer trust, and it's good for the bottom line. It seems like a no-brainer. But earlier, you mentioned this company called Human. What role do they play in all of this?
So Human is a cybersecurity company that's making waves in this space. They offer solutions that are specifically designed to help businesses, tackle those challenges that come with the new PCI DSS requirements,
Yeah.
especially the ones around client-side security, which we've been talking a lot about.
So they're the ones helping businesses wrangle all those third-party scripts and making sure nothing malicious is slipping through the cracks.
You got it. Their main product is called Client-Side Defense, and it's aimed at simplifying compliance with requirements 6.4.3 and 11.6.1. Those tricky ones related to script inventory and HTTP header modifications.
Right. Right.
So think of it like it's a comprehensive management system for all of your client scripts.
Okay.
It gives you a detailed inventory of every script. It helps you authorize and justify each one.
Okay.
And it continuously monitors them for any unauthorized changes.
So it's like having a 247 security detail for your third-party scripts.
That's a great way to put it. It helps businesses gain that, that much needed visibility into what's happening in the browser, which is absolutely critical for meeting those new PCI DSS requirements.
This has been incredibly insightful. We've really covered a lot, from the changing threat landscape to the nitty-gritty of PCI DSS compliance, and even how companies like Human are stepping in to help. But I do have one final question for you.
Shoot.
We've talked a lot about how version 4.0 is addressing the current state of client-side attacks, but technology is always evolving. What about the future? What new technologies or approaches do you think we'll see to enhance payment security down the line? What's next in this arms race?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If I had a crystal ball, I wouldn't be here.
Yeah, you'd be on a beach somewhere.
Exactly. But, looking at where things are headed, one thing's for sure, we're going to see even more focus on zero trust security. It means moving away from that old way of thinking where you trust everything inside your network.
So not just building bigger walls.
Right. You're verifying every single person, every device that's trying to get in, even if they seem like they're already on the inside.
So it's about assuming that anything could be compromised, right? Any device, any user, any connection.
Yeah, that's the idea. Continuous authentication, really granular access controls, and real-time threat detection are going to be even more important.
And I imagine AI and machine learning are going to play a big role in all of that.
Huge role. They're already being used, to analyze tons of data, looking for patterns that might signal malicious activity.
Yeah.
As AI and machine learning get smarter, they'll get even better at detecting and responding to these threats in real time, maybe even predicting them before they happen.
So it's almost like having a digital immune system for your business.
That's a great way to put it. And just like our own immune systems, they'll have to keep adapting
Yeah.
to stay ahead of the bad guys.
It's a constant race. What about blockchain? I keep hearing how that has the potential to change everything when it comes to security.
Definitely technology to watch. Blockchain, its strength is that it's, immutable.
Meaning?
Once something is recorded, it's really hard to tamper with.
Oh, okay.
So we might see blockchain being used to make payment systems more secure and transparent, where every transaction is recorded on this, unchangeable ledger.
That would add a lot of trust to the system.
It would. And it could streamline things, reduce costs.
Okay, yeah. So blockchain is definitely one to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
Well, we've covered a ton of ground today,
Yeah.
From the evolving threat landscape to the ins and outs of PCI DSS 4.0, and even what the future of payment security might look like.
It's exciting stuff.
It is. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought.
I'm all ears.
We've talked about technology, compliance, all of that.
Yeah.
But security is really about more than just, tools and checklists. It's about people.
Couldn't agree more. Even with the most cutting-edge technology, human error can still mess things up.
Exactly. So as you move forward, think about how you can empower your employees to really be a part of your security efforts. Train them to spot phishing scams, to use good passwords, and to report anything that looks suspicious. Because a truly secure business is one where everyone's doing their part to protect sensitive information.
Well said. Security is a team effort. Everyone needs to be informed and on their toes.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. We hope you found it valuable and that you feel better equipped to navigate this sometimes complicated world of payment security.
Knowledge is power.
Yeah.
The more you understand, the better prepared you'll be.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay secure.
Keep those security updates coming.
We'll be here ready to dive in.
Absolutely.
Thanks again.